I should probably double check that actually. Hold on a second. Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this episode, I'm going to be reviewing Don't Breathe, the new film from Fede Alvarez, as well as Yoga Hosers, the new film from writer-director Kevin Smith. But before we get into that, I wanted to delve into a couple trailers that I saw actually right before Don't Breathe. First, we have Ouija, however you say that, the board game, Origin of Evil. And this looks like an interesting sort of twist on what the first one was. It looks like the film is trying to basically reinvent itself by serving as a prequel, delving into the beginnings of how that board game ended up, kind of, I guess, cursed or haunted to begin with. The film is the latest from director Mike Flanagan, who's the guy behind the recent Netflix, I believe it was a direct-to-Netflix film, or it may not have been, but it had very limited release. And that is a thriller called Hush, that was sort of a home invasion type of deal, just like Don't Breathe, and as well as Oculus, which was kind of an underrated horror film that went under the radar a couple years ago. But it looks like the film is really kind of delving into a sort of body horror element of itself, and anticipation behind this one is actually much greater than you would think, considering that the first one was sort of critically derided. I think Mike Flanagan has like sort of a cult following going, and I think this film actually looks pretty intriguing. There's a good chance that it's just a great trailer that's going to disappoint like hell when the actual film hits theaters. But it did for someone who, I had no interest in the original film. But this actually, the fact that it's such a drastic shift from a creative standpoint, and that they are trying to, sort of tackle the franchise from a different angle and legitimize why there's a Ouija movie to begin with, I think it looks like it's taking a much more innovative approach to that. And, it's something that I'm curious about seeing. Might not be at the top of my list for the films coming out in the next few months, but definitely something that now is on my radar for the first time. So moving on to another horror sequel, Rings, which, is the third film coming after The Ring 2, which I believe was 2004, 2005. And then right after that film, I believe, underperformed because that franchise sort of fell apart pretty fast once that hit theaters. So I think the long wait, I said on the last episode that comedy sequels, really worry me when they have 10 or 15 year gaps in between. Look at Zoolander, look at Anchorman. Films like that really don't need sequels at this point anymore, and younger audiences today probably have barely a passing knowledge of them to begin with. So, The Ring is really well regarded. The sequel, I think, has essentially been lost. So this film has an interesting way in going at it, and that it's trying to bring the concept of, a videotape that kills you in 7 days and bring that into an era where videotapes no longer exist, where it's a YouTube video and involves water coming out of a webcam instead of a television, and really trying to modernize that and make it relevant for today's teenage young adult viewers. Not to mention, some of the better horror films coming out in the last few years, I feel like they really bring an element of body horror to it, where it looks like the main character is sort of gradually becoming taken over by Samara. She essentially has a kind of a, I guess, word in, I don't know what it's written in, but some kind of language burnt into her hand from the phone when she answers for the 7 days, and I'm just realizing that was actually a handheld phone and not a cell phone. You would think that they would find a way to make it a cell phone since they're trying to modernize it, and most people don't really have landlines anymore. They're sort of falling out of vogue, and the movie is really trying to bring everything up to speed with today's technology. It seems a little old hat to leave the handheld phone in place there, but I digress. has a word burnt into her hand that means rebirth, or a symbol that means rebirth. And, there's some really eerie images with her pulling what appears to be a braid of Samara's. And, for those of you who haven't seen the originals, Samara's the little girl that, with the long hair that crawls out of the TV, spoilers, I guess, for The Ring, pulls a braid of Samara's hair out of her throat. And there's one really kind of interesting image where it looks like her hand is sort of melded to Samara's hand, or a hand is melded to Samara's hand. It could be creative editing there for all I know. But it does look like they're trying to get a jump start and sort of cut off the naysayers that might be like, do we really need another sequel to The Ring? Because, actually I'm one of them. I enjoyed the first one enough, but there was nothing in it where I thought it was, the best horror film to come along in ages. And, the most memorable scene happens towards the very end of the film. So there was nothing in it specifically that stood out to me as this is a giant, like an icon of horror that's being created right before our eyes. But it has sort of developed that reputation as one of the best horror films in the 2000s. So it'll be interesting to see if Rings can really bring that franchise back up to speed, especially now in an era of James Wan films and Fede Alvarez films, as I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so Rings finally coming out. I know it got pushed back from a spring release. Makes a lot more sense for it to hit theaters right around the time of Halloween, which is, I'm sure, is what the studio was thinking. So it'll be interesting to see how this Halloween shapes up with all the horror films hitting theaters. I feel like this is going to be the first Halloween in maybe a decade or so that we haven't had a Saw or a Paranormal Activity film hitting theaters, since both of them are sort of on at least a hiatus right now. I've heard rumors about the Saw franchise picking back up, but yeah, so it'll be an interesting box office contest between the horror films of 2016. Okay, so I just saw Don't Breathe, the new film from director Fede Alvarez. For those of you who are unaware, he's the guy that directed the 2013 remake/reboot, I guess it sort of depends on who you ask, of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead franchise, which of course now is continued on to the Starz television series Ash vs. Evil Dead, but I digress. So Raimi produced that film, as well as this one, through his Ghost House Pictures production company. So Jane Levy stars as a young woman who's putting together one big heist with her friends, her boyfriend and a friend, who they break into homes and rob them, and basically they're putting together one big score to steal a large sum of money from this blind man who's, a war veteran, who's kind of an agoraphobic, doesn't really leave his house, that kind of thing, so that they can start their life over again. Move to California from Detroit. Jane Levy's character, Rocky, has a shitty home life. Her mom is a complete dick, and her mom's boyfriend's constantly over, so she wants to take her little sister and go to the other side of the country to sort of start over and save her little sister from this toxic environment. Now, from there, things get way more complicated when they break into the man's house. The man, of course, the blind man, played by Stephen Lang of Avatar fame primarily. He's been in a million other things, and he's probably the most rumored / fan casted actor to play Cable in the X-Men franchise. So we'll see if this movie helps his chances of getting cast to play that character for Deadpool 2, because I know they're going to bring Cable in there. But they realize that the blind man that they're robbing from, is not really as easy a mark as they initially anticipated. Of course, they end up basically kind of trapped in the house with the man and trying to evade capture while also finding a way out of the house, preferably with the money that they came to get in the first place. Now from there, it just really kind of spirals into basically 90 minutes, or a little less, I guess. You have about maybe 15-20 minutes of setup up front, just kind of to establish the stakes, primarily for Levy's character. And it's really just an exercise in suspense from there on out. It's very Hitchcockian in the way that Fede Alvarez really kind of sets up his shots. I thought that it really had a lot of cool camera moves. The camera really kind of pans around the house. There's tracking shots throughout the house, kind of establishing where things are, setting up things that are later going to pay off in the story. Just kind of building tension as you see the blind man move throughout the house, kind of trying to track them and them trying to evade him. And the movie has a lot of really interesting techniques that it uses in order to establish what's going down visually. For example, there's a sequence where he essentially turns the lights out on them. That's not a reference to the movie from earlier this summer, Lights Out, which I also liked quite a bit. But turns the lights out on them because, after all, as a blind man, he doesn't need light. So the movie sort of goes to this kind of grayscale thing, because a lot of times when films do things like that, they go straight to like night vision style, but because doesn't need, none of the characters in this scene have night vision goggles on, it doesn't serve that purpose of that story in that way, that he does sort of a grayscale thing where we can see what's happening, but like just clearly, but like enough to convey the idea that these actors are completely in the dark. I don't know if they filmed it that way or what's going on. They may very well may have, because I don't know if it's a digital effect or if it's something that was done on set and therefore because it was shot in the dark. But the characters that can see, their pupils are dilated as if, they're reacting to the darkness, and then having to, how your eyes adjust with light. So I thought that was a really cool detail. Just the framing throughout, the craft that Alvarez puts into this film is so impressive. Like, you can tell you're dealing with a next level filmmaker. And I know I've read some things online where people are saying about, this is a renaissance for horror right now between Lights Out and I know The Shallows did really well, and there's a couple other ones this year. I would say that's sort of led by James Wan with The Conjuring and the Insidious films. And I definitely think Fede Alvarez is a big component of that. I'd say that between Evil Dead, which I liked a lot, and Don't Breathe, I think he's really establishing himself as one of the leading horror directors. And I really love the fact that he brings back Jane Levy, who was the main star of Evil Dead, and pulled off a really compelling performance there as, both the vulnerable version of her character Mia and the possessed version that was. So she sort of played the hero and the villain of the same story in a really convincing, really chilling way that, every time when I think about that movie, it still kind of sticks with me. And that's really hard for a horror filmmaker to pull off a remake, a reboot, whatever you want to call that, of a beloved franchise, and to create a hero that is memorable, maybe not in the same way that Bruce Campbell's Ashes, because he's never 100% serious. He's usually, the first one maybe, but even that, a lot of people consider that more campy than anything. But he's more of a hamming it up, like action hero style, in the way that his larger than life portrayal of Ashes, just in reacting to stuff, and it's almost more darkly comedic, especially in Army of Darkness, but in Evil Dead 2 and throughout the franchise. Whereas Mia was more of a serious, like, hero, serious villain. And that movie had a really interesting metaphor as far as, kind of using the whole thing that Mia's character was going through withdrawals from a drug addiction, and whether the supernatural stuff was sort of an extension of that. And there was a big question early in the movie of, if she's hallucinating these things, or if she's lying to them to try and get out so she can get drugs, because she's she's dealing with the trauma of that. And Don't Breathe doesn't really delve too deeply into that kind of metaphor, but there are a lot of twists along the way. There's a lot of personal stakes at play for both Jane Levy's Rocky and Stephen Lang's, I guess he's unnamed because he's credited as the blind man. So I guess that's that. And the supporting performances, Dylan Minnette especially, these are really characters that you root for in some sense. But then you find yourself wondering, well, who should I root for here? Because at least early on, before things get much more complicated, as you know, I want you guys to see this, so I'm trying to be as spoiler-free and vague as possible. But at least early on, when they break into his house, and you know, he's trying to find them and you know, hunt them down, or even defend himself with violence if necessary. You know, they're breaking into his house to steal his money. One of them, you know, I don't want to get into specifics. It's hard to talk about this without getting into specifics. But they're the ones trespassing. They're the ones breaking and entering. They're the ones that are committing a crime. So to a certain respect, you sort of think he's in the right. Again, like I said, at least early on, before it gets more complicated. But so it puts you in this interesting moral quandary where you're not sure who is the lesser of two evils up front with that basic premise. And I think that's an interesting place to be in, because you know, there's chances in this film where the main characters have an opportunity to turn back. They have an opportunity to leave the money and get out. And they're like, no, I need this money. Especially Rocky. He has plans for it, as I explained up front. And like I said, all that stuff with her and her motivation, that's established in maybe the first 15 minutes of the movie. So that's not really a spoiler. So it puts you in this interesting place as far as from a audience standpoint. Levy here is just as good as she was in Evil Dead. I think it's a less demanding performance for her, or less demanding role rather. She more plays the straight up final girl type here, and she doesn't have to bring as much darkness to it as she did in Evil Dead. But I do think that if she keeps teaming up with Alvarez for these kinds of films, I mean, she has the potential to be the next horror icon. I mean, she already has two really strong characters and potential franchises. I don't know if they're going to continue Don't Breathe with sequels, either with her coming back or taking it in another direction, but they certainly can. I mean, I don't think that's a spoiler to say that there are places that this can go, with or without Jane Levy, Stephen Lang, or whoever. You could do prequels, you could do sequels, you could do spin-offs. You take this basic premise of, you know, sort of an interesting spin on the home invasion film, where it's actually, you know, double home invasion in a way. It's like they're the ones invading the home, but they're the ones who end up in peril. So it reminds me, it's like if you think of, you know, classic home invasion films, where the people invading the house are actually the ones that end up in trouble. And in that way, I think it's an interesting subversion of expectations, and kind of taking that genre and putting a new spin on it, putting something fresh into it. And as we all know, horror is one of the hardest genres to do something fresh and different with. And I feel like this film really manages to do that in an incredible way that is kind of transcendent, as far as, you know, it's not just a great horror film, it's a suspense thriller. It brings something new to it. I feel like it's violent enough that, you know, people that are watching horror films for that get what they came for, but it's not to the point where it's gratuitous. It doesn't ever get close to, you know, torture porn and that kind of territory. And so I have to say, I was really impressed by Don't Breathe. I had heard really good things going in, but I think I was possibly even better than I expected it to be. So for Don't Breathe, from director Fede Alvarez, I think I have to go with 4.5 out of 5. This is almost certainly going to be on my top 10 of the year. And if any of you have any interest in the film based on what I've said, I would highly encourage you to check it out. And from what I heard, it did really well this weekend. It may have even been number one. And from, you know, after seeing the film, I think it's pretty easy to guess that it had a pretty modest budget. I haven't have to check on that, but it's almost certainly going to be a hit. So Don't Breathe, highly, highly, highly recommended from me. One of the best films of the year, probably the best horror film this year that I've seen. So definitely check it out. and enjoy. Writer-director Kevin Smith returns with Yoga Hosers, the sequel/spin-off to his 2014 horror film Tusk, which was essentially about a crazy old man wanting to turn a young man into a walrus. And those of you who listen to Smith's podcast or follow him across his multimedia presence on television and obviously with his films on the internet, he's basically everywhere. And I'm a big fan of his. I should probably throw that out right out the gate. I did enjoy Tusk to a minor extent. I felt like the film had a lot of elements that worked as a straight up. Again, this seems to be the theme of this episode in large respect, as far as body horror goes, and creature design and that kind of thing. So I enjoyed certain elements of it, but I was less supportive of Johnny Depp's role as Guy Lapointe, the French-Canadian private detective who is recruited by the characters played by Haley Joel Osment and Genesis Rodriguez to track down the missing podcaster played by Justin Long. I felt like he didn't really fit the tone of that film, and it had this bizarre shift halfway through when he shows up that I never really could 100% get behind. However, I'm really impressed and sort of admire Smith's sort of tenacity to not only turn an idea that he had on a podcast with his friend Scott Mosier, friend and producer Scott Mosier, and turn it into a real film. Like, take such a wacky idea and make it a legitimate film that some people went to see, that he toured around the country. And yes, it doesn't work for most people. And yes, it didn't exactly light the box office on fire. But it does prove that he when he really sets his mind to something, he goes for it full stop. So for that respect, in that way, I really respect the film, and I really like a lot of what he did do. I thought Michael Park's performance was really strong. I thought Justin Long's performance was really strong. So going into Yoga Hosers, the previous film had Harley Quinn Smith's daughter, and Lily Rose Depp, Johnny Depp's daughter, sort of in a cameo appearance as two teenage girls obsessed with their phones and working behind the counter of a convenience store in Canada. Of course, that's right in Smith's wheelhouse because of the Clerks films and all. And I think he was sort of motivated not only by the fact, wanting to give his daughters a starring role in a film, but just sort of creating a film that's about teenage girls and sort of a twisted monster movie that caters to that audience, which we haven't really, not to my knowledge, haven't ever really seen. And I believe this is Smith's first PG-13 film, which is also kind of a big deal, considering that the man loves his F-bombs and his sexual humor, and his last couple quote-unquote experimental films, Red State and Tusk, were very big on violence and blood and sort of leaned into the gore aspect of it to a large extent. And Yoga Hosers really scales that back. I mean, there's a little bit of that in the third act, but for the most part, the girls, who are both named Colleen in the film, so they're known as the Colleens. The Colleens take on these little foot-tall sausage Nazis. That is, Nazis made out of sausage, all of which are played by Smith himself in prosthetics, and so because of that, they're filled with sauerkraut and sausage. So they don't, when they explode, nothing. There's no blood, there's no guts, so there's nothing to worry about as far as from the MPAA standpoint. Similarly to the way that Suicide Squad had the Enchantress turn people into these faceless globs that the villains / anti-heroes are able to just run around shooting without having any issue as far as this is too intense for children and all that, even though that film has a whole bunch of thematic issues that should caution parents to begin with. that part of it they sort of evaded, and Yoga Hosers takes a similar approach. Now, the film features a lot of cameos and small roles for not only the returning cast of Tusk, the main three, Genesis Rodriguez, Haley Joel Osment, and Justin Long, all have some role in the film, but also Smith's Hollywood Babylon podcast co-host Ralph Garman has a huge part in the third act, especially one that really was clearly written to tailored to his strengths. And people that know that podcast will be able to probably figure out pretty fast what those are. I'm trying to avoid spoilers for the film, as well as Jennifer Schwalbach-Smith and Vanessa Paradis and Jason Mewes. There's a bunch of little appearances by Smith alumni, friends and family, that sort of give the film very much a passion project feel, which it is for Smith. I mean, he really uses these crazy ideas that he comes up with as an excuse to put something new and different out there, and whether it's good or bad or works for people or doesn't, it's a vision that he had. It's a film that only he would make. And by recruiting all these people so close to him to sort of fill out the cast, it really carries that spirit throughout it. That it is just Smith just having fun and making a silly movie with a bunch of friends. And to that regard, I feel like a lot of critics really kind of shit all over the movie because it is so weird and different. And I'll agree it doesn't work for the most part. There are a lot of parts that don't work. There are a lot of scenes that fall flat for me. But I feel like Smith and Depp, the little versions, the girl versions, the teenage girl versions of Smith and Depp, because obviously they're the elder Smith and Depp, their fathers are also in this film. The girls are really strong and very natural and have a kind of a charisma on screen. They actually do some singing in the film. And I thought that all came across very, very endearing. The fact that they're friends in real life definitely is captured with the characters they play on screen. I feel like Lily Rose Depp in particular has sort of a knack for that like sarcastic, biting, dry humor. She plays the I guess, harsher of the two, in that she's a little more in your face. She's a little more hard edge, as opposed to Harley Quinn Smith's more naive, slightly more innocent version of a teenage girl. And I think that the two of them, they strike that perfect balance that makes the decision to put them front and center in a film not completely unwarranted. And I'm glad that we get to see more of them here. I'm glad that Guy Lapointe, Depp's character, returns here and actually fits with the story this time. In the other one, as I mentioned, he just sort of throws a giant monkey wrench in the really dark and serious and fucked up story that is going on in Tusk. And to me, he stuck out like a sore thumb. And a lot of his more affected performance with the ridiculous accent and the prosthetic nose didn't fit with what that movie was going for thematically, or as far as its really disturbing tone. It felt more in line with Red State to me, and this one feels more in line with something like Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. Granted, it's actually more absurd. It doesn't have the same kind of stoner vibe to it, but it is about two friends sort of in this crazy adventure, dealing with ridiculous stuff and having to try and rely on each other to figure things out. And in that way, it worked for me. The third act goes way overboard and way ridiculous, and the fact that it's intentional sort of doesn't redeem it, but it inspires me to go a little lighter on it. The fact that this is a movie that is not trying to be taken seriously. It's trying to be one of those films that you flip around on cable channel, on cable networks, and find it at 1 o'clock in the morning when you had a little bit to drink, or maybe smoke something, or in some other state of heightened awareness, and you're just chilling out, enjoying this insane movie where this crazy shit happens and these two teenage girls fight Nazis made out of sausage that are literally called Bratzies. So I can't wholeheartedly recommend it because the movie is so divisive. I think it might work a shade less for me than Tusk, because I think there was some real drama and gravitas that film had, but it does feel more cohesive than Tusk did, because in large part because of Depp's character sort of throwing that movie off the rails a little bit, whereas in this one I feel like he does play more like the French-Canadian Clouseau that he was intended to be. Of course, Smith has said time and again that what he's calling the True North trilogy will conclude probably in a couple of years with Moose Jaws, which is exactly what it sounds, a riff on Jaws with a moose. I'm assuming, roaming the Canadian wilderness in the same way that Steven Spielberg's 1975 classic had a shark kind of wreaking havoc on a small beach town. So it's already been announced that the Colleens will return. I'm almost certain that will mean Guy Lapointe will return, and a lot of these same actors probably come back in different roles. I'm still excited to see that, even though neither of these two films I think are out-and-out winners and are not the best that Smith has had to offer. For me, I'd still say the Clerks films and Dogma are probably my personal favorites. Dogma probably a slight edge over both of the Clerks movies, simply because I like the religious themes and the commentary that film brings to it. And I really do believe that, Ben Affleck's performance in that, Matt Damon's performance in that, Alan Rickman's performance in that are all really strong. And it's probably the best use of Jay and Silent Bob in Smith's films, mostly because they actually serve the overarching story in an interesting way. So they fit better with the actual narrative, which doesn't center on them. And I apologize for the sound quality right now. It's been raining out here, so that's not helping. That's not helping the podcast in any way. But when you're dealing with a tropical storm, a little bit of noise pollution is I guess the best you can hope for. So to recap this episode, Don't Breathe from director Fede Alvarez, highly recommended. Definitely check that out. Great film. Almost certainly going to be in my top 10 of the year, as I said earlier. Kevin Smith's Yoga Hosers is, I saw it at the Fathom event a couple of days early, but it's hitting theaters on Friday, September 2nd. So when you hear this, it may already be playing. It's in a limited release, so you might have to hunt it down. If not, I'm sure it will be hitting, DVD probably by the end of the year. I wouldn't be surprised. Recommended for Smith devotees particularly, but also people who just want to see some crazy shit and kind of let loose and just have an out of control time at the movies. It has enough comedy that you should find plenty to enjoy there. Just don't take it too seriously, and maybe have a couple beers before you go for it. That'll be all for this episode of the Crooked Table Podcast. Next week, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to be talking about. I have been reading Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, like many of you have, I'm sure. So there's a good chance I may try and work that into an upcoming episode, if not the next one, maybe the one after that. But definitely check out crookedtable.com for more podcasts, videos, reviews, and other movie-related goodies. I'm getting ready to start moving on with videos and video reviews and other, perhaps some Let's Talk About Six segments. Probably next month, so early October. Look for another video on the Crooked Table YouTube channel. Been a little lax in that regard, but you can also find me on Twitter at Crooked Table. We're also on Facebook, Tumblr, pretty much all the social media sites. Crooked Table is on there. So I look forward to hearing from you and your thoughts on this episode. Give us a review in iTunes. And until next time, this is Rob saying roll credits.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved. Z-R-O-O-K-E-D.